Just the idea, the concept of wearing this yarn on your head. Does that speak to you or not? Hi everyone, Kristen from Maybe Better Wanna Knits here today with my cat Dory to talk to you about building a yarn stash that works for you. I have, as you can see behind me, a lovely yarn stash, and I think that stashing yarn is a good idea so that you have materials on hand. If you want to start, random new projects, you don't always have to order. If you've got a good sock yarn stash, you suddenly decide you need socks, here you go, you've got your sock yarns. But I also think stashing has this connotation of being kind of random, building up a supply of materials that you don't end up using, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I wanted to share some tips today for building a stash that actually works for you and for your knitting hobby. Kind of finding that fine line between unhinged yarn buying and very precise planning. We can find a nice middle ground so that we don't end up with a stash full of yarn we don't actually want to use, and instead can actually view it as an integral part of our knitting practice, something that is there to support us. So these are going to be my 5 tips for stashing yarn and building a yarn stash that is functional but still fun. So let's start. Number 1, don't be completely random. So as I said, I think stashing has this connotation of, oh, this was pretty, oh, this is pretty, oh, I'm at a yarn festival, I've got to buy all this yarn, I don't know what I'm going to use it for, ha ha ha. And that's fine occasionally, but to have a yarn stash that actually works for you and supports you, you can't be completely random. You need to go into stash building with some kind of guidelines or goals. That doesn't mean you have to know exactly what project you're going to use it for, but I think it does mean that you need to be realistic about the kinds of yarn that you use and that you like, the kinds of projects that you make, and the kinds of things that you don't like and the kinds of things that you don't make. So for example, if you don't knit socks, there is no reason for you to just be buying random skeins of sock yarn. If you don't actually like floofy sweaters, you really don't need to be buying floofy mohair yarn, no matter how pretty it is. Approach yarn buying with some self-awareness, some self-knowledge. That doesn't mean you have to know exactly what you're going to use your yarn for every time you buy it, but it does mean that you are cognizant of what's getting used, what kind of projects you're making, what kind of yarn you're using, and what you're simply not. So tip number 1, don't be completely random and unhinged and just buying everything that's ooh shiny. You can still have fun, but take a step back before you start yarn purchasing and bring a little bit of realism to the process. Number 2, when you are ready to do some yarn shopping, you don't have to have a specific project in mind, but you should have a vague idea of a project for a given yarn you're considering buying. Now, obviously, a single skein of sock yarn makes a pair of socks. That doesn't require a whole lot of hemming and hawing. Either you knit socks or you don't, and you like that sock yarn or you don't, but again, going back to point number 1, if you only wear solid color socks or striped socks, there's no reason for you to be buying, variegated sock yarn. But more to the point, when you're considering any given yarn, think about what kind of project you might be using it for. So you don't end up buying random yarn thinking, oh, I'll definitely find something for this. And how many times has that happened and then you don't find anything for it? So consider what that yarn is going to be appropriate for and what you might use it for. If you're looking at a yarn that is a single ply fingering weight, that's actually not going to be good for socks. If there's something you might use that for, perhaps a sweater, then you'll know you have to buy more of it. It doesn't make sense just to buy one skein of it, because one skein of it is basically only appropriate for socks and shawls. And if you're not a shawl knitter and you know that you want socks that last more than one wash cycle, one skein, completely useless. If you found a skein of worsted weight yarn that you just love, what are you going to do with one skein of worsted weight yarn? Is it enough for a hat? Maybe you're going to make a hat. Would you like that kind of yarn in a hat? You don't have to know exactly which hat. Just the idea, the concept of wearing this yarn on your head. Does that speak to you or not? Certain yarns, certain yarn colors look better in certain kind of projects. Personally, there are a lot of really beautiful variegated yarns out there, but I know I am only going to use a heavily variegated yarn on socks. That's it. I am never going to put it in a sweater. I'm never going to put it in a hat because I will not wear it that way. I'm not going to put it in a shawl because the shawl patterning and stitch patterns are going to completely conflict with the variation in the yarn. So I'm never going to use it for a shawl. So if I like a variegated yarn, but it's on a DK weight yarn, I'm not going to buy that because I'm never going to use it. I'm never going to use a single skein of variegated DK weight yarn on anything. So know what kind of project either you're particularly shopping for. Say, oh, I need more sweater quantities in my stash. Know that going in. Or when you're shopping and you're considering a particular yarn, consider the kinds of projects that you might actually use it for, rather than just say, oh, pretty. So connected with point number one. Point number two, have a vague idea of the project that your yarn might be used for. It's not a commitment of any kind. You can always change your mind later, but before you bring it home and put it in your stash and it ends up just sitting there, really give some good consideration to what it will work for and what it won't, and if that thing is something that you are actually going to make. Being realistic, having vague project ideas in mind. Number three, learn the approximate amounts of yarn you need for different kinds of projects in different weights of yarn. This is something you'll start to pick up on as you become more and more of an experienced knitter. So obviously a single skein of sock yarn works for a pair of socks for most sizes. Assuming this is a 100 gram skein of sock yarn, that's usually 400 to 450 yards, and that's enough for a pair of socks. That one's pretty straightforward. Some other ones, you may need some practice. So a hat in a worsted weight yarn maybe requires 200 yards. A DK weight yarn, maybe it requires a little bit more, 250 yards. A shawl, most of them, a shawlette is maybe a single skein of fingering weight yarn. Anything bigger is going to need at least 2 skeins of a fingering weight yarn. And where this is really, really key is with sweaters, because there is a much less variation in hat sizing than there is in sweater sizing. Most hat patterns include, like maybe 3 sizes, 18, 20, 22 inch brim circumference. And because hats are relatively small, the amount of yarn used overall is not changing a whole lot. That is not the case for sweaters. So you need to know your measurements for your sweater. And as your body is maybe changing as you grow older, or you get pregnant, or you go on a diet, continue to be aware of your measurements and how much yarn usually you need for your size sweater in the most common sweater weights. So maybe a worsted and a DK. If you really like a lot of lighter fingering weight sweaters, that one as well. So I know most of the time for a sweater in my size, I need about 1,000 yards. That can change a little bit. If it's going to have shorter sleeves or a more cropped body, it might go down a little bit. If it's got a lot of cables, it's going to go up. But I know around 1,000 yards is what I need for a worsted weight sweater. DK weight sweater, 1,200, 1,300 yards. Fingering weight sweater, maybe 1,500 yards, again, depending on the sleeves and the length of the body and whether there's a lot of cables. So this is something that I have just, sort of picked up on over so many years of knitting, and you will eventually too, but if you are more new to it or you're just not the kind of person that remembers that thing, it never hurts to just kind of jot down a little note, carry it around in your wallet so that you know the approximate amount of yarn you need for a sweater. If sweaters are a thing that you like to knit. Obviously that in my case is true, might not be for you. But knowing approximately how much yarn you need is going to prevent you from buying odd amounts of yarn that aren't enough for anything. So a single skein of a worsted weight yarn is usually around 110 yards. That's not enough for almost anything. So no matter how much you like that yarn, what are you going to do with one skein of worsted weight yarn? Nothing. You've got to buy at least 2 to make a hat. So rather than buying the wrong amount, ending up with yarn in your stash that isn't enough for anything and you're never going to use, have a vague idea of your yarn amounts that you need for your different projects. So when you are in point 2 and thinking about vaguely what kind of project you might want to be making, you then move on to point 3, approximately how much yarn will you need for said imaginary project so that you can make sure you buy enough. So tip number 3, start getting a better idea of how much yarn you need for particular kinds of projects. Write it down if you need to and carry it around in your wallet so that you're buying usable quantities of yarn and not just random ones. That said, tip number 4, if the yarn is discontinued, if it has very small dye lots, buy an extra skein. Once it's gone, and that yarn is not coming back. And if you are missing just one skein because your approximate amount was slightly off, there is nothing to be done. So there are certain yarns that, are just never going to get discontinued. But particularly if we're talking about indie dyed yarn in colorways that are not guaranteed to come back, in colorways that are dyed in smaller dye lots. If we're talking about some companies just tend to launch and then discontinue yarn lines relatively frequently. Things like that. Buy an extra skein. Better to have an extra skein than not enough. And again, this is particularly true if you are purchasing sweater quantities where, if you have a hat and the dye lot is slightly different, maybe, it's not even going to be noticeable to most people. It's not going to bother you. It probably would not bother me, but if I had a sweater and I had to use a different dye, it would drive me insane. So obviously you can't always predict when yarn lines are just going to disappear. We're not clairvoyant. We can't predict the future, but if you know things like this is an indie dyer who changes their colorways frequently, or this company seems to be on shaky ground, not sure how much longer they're going to be here, buy the extra skein. You'll be much happier that you have it than if you don't. And my last suggestion when you were going to be stashing yarn is to, perhaps before you go on your Rhinebeck adventure or you're just hitting the local yarn shop, take a look at your wardrobe and see what colors you have, and if you particularly feel like there is some color missing, or if you want to make sure that you're getting colors that match what you already have. So unless you're the type of person that just likes to wear lots of different colors and you don't really have a color palette, it's fine, good for you. But if you are a person perhaps more like me who wants all of your things to match and coordinate and go together, and you're not into sort of a lot of color variety, it can be really easy to see that yarn and think, oh, this is so beautiful. I absolutely love this. What a beautiful color. But if it's not a color you actually wear, then you're just wasting your money. And this can be particularly true when we're in fiber festival season and dyers are doing show specific colorways. Sometimes they're gorgeous and you want to have that memento of your occasion. But if you are never actually going to wear that color, it doesn't, it doesn't go with your skin tone. It doesn't, it's like if I bought bright orange, I would never wear that. It would look awful. It doesn't match anything in your closet. If you always wear a pink jacket with everything, do you really want a shawl that's going to completely clash with your jacket that you're always wearing? No matter how, pretty it looks in the skein. This goes back to a little bit to my original point about going into the situation with some self-awareness. It is easy to get distracted by new things and special things and pretty things, even if we wouldn't actually wear those things. So consider your own wardrobe, not just your other knits, but your regular clothes, your tops and jeans and dresses and coats. And I think coats is a thing we don't think about a lot because we're only wearing them for a small part of the year. But when we're talking about mittens and scarves and hats, it's going to actually be kind of key that you maybe don't want all of your knitwear clashing with your coat. And the coat is, tends to be the more expensive thing that you're not going to replace easily. So it's easier to make your knitwear match the coat. You just want to be realistic about what you are actually going to wear, so you don't end up with a stash full of colors that look really nice in the skein, but when you look at them, you think, no, I wouldn't actually wear this. Or you use them and then you make something and then you realize that you're not going to actually wear it. So that is my last tip. Color coordination doesn't always have to be perfect, but be aware of what actually isn't going to fit into your life and your wardrobe before you start your yarn shopping. All right, and I have one last bonus tip for you, and it is specifically about variegated yarns. As I said, people have different opinions on this, but variegated yarns can be very tricky to wear in anything but socks. But my last tip for you is, if you would like to buy a variegated yarn like this on a heavier weight base, which is what I have here. This is a worsted weight from Kitty Pryde Fibers. Buy a coordinating solid. Even if you don't know what you're going to do with them, 2 skeins of worsted weight yarn, in most cases, is going to be enough for hat or a pair of slippers or a cowl. And variegated yarns, you can really tame them down a little bit if you pair them with a coordinating solid. So in this case, putting these two together might make a more wearable, whatever you may think, hat, cowl, whatever. If you were to stripe them, or to use, or to do 2-color brioche. That way you don't have this all over busy color. You're taming it down a little bit with this. This may not work for everybody. Maybe you don't like brioche. Maybe you love just to have crazy all over variegated color. But if you're just kind of doing the, ooh, shiny, I love it, I don't know what I would make with it, but I really have to have it, consider buying a coordinating solid color that, if you end up trying to use your variegated yarn, can sort of tame it a little bit. Make it a little bit more wearable, a little bit easier to coordinate with your other clothes, a little bit easier to manage than an all over crazy variegated. So, and again, this is, in case you love it, Kitty Pryde Fibers. This is from her Diversity collection. This one is called Situation Untenable, and this one is called Gender Diversity. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. I hope you found it useful in providing some guidance on making realistic choices when you go yarn shopping, so that you can build a stash that actually works for you, and not one that just looks maybe pretty on the shelf but isn't actually very useful. If you did enjoy the video or find it useful, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see lots of other knitting related content here on the Media Peruana Knits channel. We've got vlogs and tutorials and a podcast and all of that good stuff. Thank you again for joining me, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye. Hi, Dory. Okay, huh? You want to come whine at me? Do you want to be in a video? Come on. Come on. You can do it. I know you're an old lady. There we go. Okay. Did you want to be in a video, Dory? Is that it? Want to be in a video? This is my very old cat, Dory. She is 18. And she still jumped up in my lap all by herself. She's doing pretty well. And she has a lot of fur. Anyway, I guess she'll be joining us for a bit today.